Hello all and welcome to a Hyp3rblue Reviews Retrospective. I've been reviewing video games for almost 3 years now. I started writing game reviews a few years prior, but never published anything before 2019. I'm still refining the process and how I review games, and I'm trying to learn from previous mistakes. There's always more to learn when it comes to writing, video editing, and games themselves. That being said, I wanted to take a moment and correct some things that I got wrong in previous reviews. I also wanted to look back and go over some of my harsher reviews, as well as tackle some things that didn't make much sense to me after rereading the original scripts for some of these videos. There are also some things that I missed in some of my reviews that I want to talk about as well. One more thing before we get started, I'm only going to discuss my video game reviews in this video. I'm sure there are tons of things I got wrong in my movie reviews, but that will require its own video. That being said, let's get started. These games are in no particular order, but without further ado, let's start with one of my lowest scored games, Deliriant. So I was pretty hard on Deliriant. I gave it a 1 out of 5 because, to be blunt, it just wasn't that interesting of a game. I still think that harsh review is justified, but I wanted to discuss the story, as it is, a bit more. I released a deep dive on Deliriant earlier this month to see if I could actually piece together a story. Honestly, I didn't find much. I did, however, want to go over some things that occurred to me after my third playthrough of the game. I believe that the main protagonist of the game is delirious from the start. The protagonist starts in a completely white void, wandering aimlessly in search for nothing in particular. You find a door, and that seems to snap the character back to reality. Regardless of coming back to reality, the protagonist becomes delirious throughout the playthrough when she becomes triggered by the items she encounters. The protagonist seems to want to be delirious to forget about trauma in her life. I believe this is indicated by the walls moving and having flashing colors. Now, for the reason why the main character wants to be delirious, I'm not really sure. In my deep dive, I assumed it was due to physical abuse and possibly losing a child. It's difficult to say though, since there isn't any dialogue to confirm my assumptions. I'm still holding my rating of this game as a 1 out of 5. There are some little details that I missed out on my first playthrough, but not enough detail for me to figure out what's really going on. Plus, the lack of dialogue, either written or verbal, really hinders the game. So, Deliriant is still a bad game, but there appears to be a little more to it than I originally thought. Now, let this be the last time I ever talk about Deliriant. Let's move on to another poorly reviewed game, Psycho Killer. I originally gave Psycho Killer a 1 out of 5 because it's a very monotonous and boring point-and-click game with really bad FMV. Now, I found Psycho Killer to be boring for a variety of reasons, but the biggest one for me was the lack of soundtrack. I should have mentioned in my original Psycho Killer review that I was reviewing the DOS version instead of the CD-TV version. The CD-TV version does apparently have a soundtrack throughout the game. It's minimalist, but it is there. I actually believe that the DOS version does too, but given the trouble I had even finding an audio file for the game, I'm guessing there was just something wrong with my version. This isn't going to change my review though. The music still isn't enough to adjust its rating because the gameplay is still boring and the FMV is lacking. I will say though that the jazz track that they have in the game is awesome. I do want to discuss a few additional details about Psycho Killer that I missed in my initial review. I mentioned that Psycho Killer is very easy to beat if you know which arrows to click on and when to click on the killer. The game is actually so short that players have been able to beat the game within 10 minutes. That being said, there's barely any replay value to Psycho Killer besides just seeing the wacky death animations. Non-replayability aside, I also wanted to pepper in a few factoids. Apparently Psycho Killer was made in 1990, but wasn't released until 1992. Boy, I can't imagine why. Psycho Killer is actually the last game that Delta 4 released. I'm guessing the double whammy of 2 poorly reviewed games is what did them in, since this released around the same time as The Town with No Name. So again, I'm not going to change my rating on Psycho Killer. I feel like there is a good game here, it just needed more polishing prior to release. One more fun fact before I move on though, there may have actually been a Psycho Killer 2 in the works. There was a hidden video in The Town with No Name that players could find that suggested that a Psycho Killer 2 was in the works. Perhaps if Psycho Killer and The Town with No Name were more successful, then we may have seen the sequel. Either way, for better or for worse, we never got to see a sequel to Psycho Killer. In any case, speaking of The Town with No Name, I originally gave The Town with No Name a 3 out of 5, and I honestly think that score is way too low. In all honesty though, I do feel like I got a couple of things wrong with The Town with No Name, which is a shame because it's actually one of my favorite games, and I feel like I need to do it justice. The first thing I'll mention is that I reviewed the DOS version of the game. There are some differences, namely the soundtrack and sound effects. Again, this issue may be related to the audio file that I found, but I'm not entirely sure. In my original review, I mentioned that the creators probably had a lot of fun making The Town with No Name, and the bonus features hidden in the game do reflect that, but the creators apparently do hate this game. Of course, this factoid was taken from IMDb, so take that with a grain of salt. I'm actually going to assume that it's true though, and that's for two reasons. The first reason being that The Town with No Name and Psycho Killer both reviewed poorly. That's gotta be a gut punch regardless. The second reason is countless people making videos making fun of the game. Granted, those videos came out in the 2000s, but I can imagine if the creators saw those videos, that they wouldn't take kindly to them. I actually assume that a lot of people had poor things to say about it regardless back in the day before YouTube was, a thing. But either way, those are my two main reasons why I think that fact is true. Now, while I certainly will mock The Town with No Name for things like the MS Paint artwork or the insane soundtrack, I contend that The Town with No Name was a pretty ambitious game. The creators of The Town with No Name did their best to get this game out there. They couldn't afford voice actors, so they just recorded everything themselves. And I honestly love this. Again, I believe the group had fun making this game. They may hate it now, but I can see the passion in this with the comedy, both comedic timing and dialogue. Honestly, they wouldn't have put it out otherwise. I respect the fact that the creators of The Town with No Name created something that they wanted and got it published. On a random aside though, given how people have seemed to now gravitated towards this bad game, I would say that it's a so bad it's good game. And like I mentioned that Plumbers Don't Wear Ties was a cult game in my review of that game, I also think that The Town with No Name is a cult game as well. It's highly quotable and now has a loving fan base for being so bad that it's good. There's also replayability with The Town with No Name. There are different dialogue and newspaper headlines after each of the fights in their respective locations. It isn't much, but if you enjoy The Town with No Name's content, then you'll want to hear everything. I've recorded most of those scenes and uploaded them to my YouTube channel if you're interested. I'm actually going to re-rate The Town with No Name. The original rating was objective, based on the gameplay. I'm going to tackle this like I did Plumbers Don't Wear Ties. In terms of gameplay, I'm giving The Town with No Name 2 towns out of 5. In terms of its so bad it's good humor and graphics, I'm giving The Town with No Name 5 zippy zeeks out of 5. So if you average it out, it's a solid 3.5 out of 5. Still a little too low, but it's higher than it was. Up next is a favorite of mine, Moses the Exodus. So this may be more of a minor correction, but in the Moses the Exodus CDI Spotlight, I said that Moses the Exodus was the first game of the Moses titles. That's apparently not true according to the information that I've found. The truth is, Moses Bound for the Promised Land apparently came out first, and then Moses the Exodus. It's just weird to me since the stories are technically backwards. I guess that makes Moses the Exodus a prequel game. Speaking of Moses titles, listening back to my more recent spotlight on Moses Bound for the Promised Land, I made a comment about being surprised that there was animation in that game. Granted, Moses the Exodus had animation too, but I did forget to add a section of the main movie that accurately described what I meant. Even though there is animation in Moses the Exodus, it's very limited, and only used in a few parts, and never used during character dialogue, at least from what I remember. Of course, while the main movie had some animation, Pyramid Pursuit desperately needed animation. Moses Bound for the Promised Land used animation during the character dialogue scenes, so I was impressed with the fact that the developers added that for one game and not the other, and that's kind of the point I was trying to make, is that there was animation, but it just wasn't enough in Moses the Exodus. Speaking of adding things, I was thinking about bumping the score of Moses the Exodus up a point for having more content than Bound for the Promised Land. And by more content, I mean it had more scenes in the Tell Me More section. But ultimately, I think I'll keep it where it's at, since it does have less animation than its predecessor. Even though Moses the Exodus does have a better game than Moses Bound for the Promised Land, it's still very confusing as well. So again, I can't really say that, that gets it an extra point or not. So again, I'm leaving Moses the Exodus at 3 out of 5. Let's go back and revisit Dogurai next. So I still find myself going back to Dogurai from time to time. It's a fun little distraction, and I feel like I was too harsh on it in my original review. Dogurai is a really fun game, especially when you unlock bones. I mentioned that Dogurai had controller throwing difficulty, but it really doesn't once you play the game and learn the mechanics. The controls are very responsive, and at the end of the day, the difficulty makes the game more challenging and ultimately enjoyable. Again, once you get through the game with Ryder and also unlock bones, the game goes from fun to really fun. I gave Dogurai a 3.5 out of 5 in my original review. I'm actually going to bump my rating of Dogurai up a point. It's a solid indie platformer, and I do highly recommend it. I have a Let's Play on my channel, linked in the description, so check it out if you're interested. With that being said, I'm giving Dogurai 4.5 boopable snooters out of 5. I've got one more review I want to look at, and it's one of my more recent reviews. Plumbers Don't Wear Ties. This one's not a major one. There's just one thing I forgot to say in that review, and that is, yes, the game is bad, and it may or may not have helped kill the 3DO. I do not fault Michael Anderson, the game's creator, for pushing to have the game published on the 3DO though. I honestly think it's awesome that he got it published at all. Michael Anderson made a game that he wanted, minus maybe the PowerPoint aspects of the game. Anderson created something fun and wanted people to experience it. And the same can probably be said for The Town with No Name, honestly. Both were misunderstood at the time and are loved by many now. I'll keep my confusing rating as is, but I wanted to mention I respect the hell out of Anderson for making something that he wanted and also getting it published. I said it in the review and I'll say it again, it's a cult game and I love it. I'm excited to grab a copy from Limited Run Games. Also, shameless plug, but you can play the entire game on my channel. The link is in the description. So those are the reviews that really stuck out to me that I felt needed more clarification. I'm sure I'll think of more things to go back to with my other reviews, but there's no need to make this video any longer than it already is. Like I said, I'm still trying to improve my craft, especially as it relates to my writing, video editing, and delivery. I'd also like to add some more comedic elements to the mix, but we'll see. Baby steps. Ultimately, I want my reviews to be informative, so that's my main focus. At this point though, I'd like to give a special thanks to those that have stuck with me through these years. I wasn't sure how many people would watch my videos, but I'm happy to see that they've gained some traction. That being said, as always, thank you for watching.